Okay, we're looking at question number 13, and which is looking at non-economic arguments and how was it able to exist, and what role did it play? Now, slavery sets the status for the people who live in slavery. Obviously, the slave owner is higher status than the slave himself. And the racial characteristic, that is, like the physical difference of how a slave looks as black and as a slave owner looks as white, connects them to other people. Like freed blacks, for example, as we'll see later, lived at a lower status than free whites, more or less. And when they didn't, that caused conflict. Of course, whites who believed that slavery only occurred because blacks were inferior to whites would find it very hard to accept the fact that their black free neighbors were living better than they were. So that racism is going to continue to haunt relationships between black and whites in the South even after slavery was over. Now, supporters of slavery had many arguments defending the status. How is it possible that I can own somebody? And I think that the video you saw kind of alludes to some of this. That you have to look at people you enslave as others. You don't enslave your own. So the idea that race that could differentiate between black and white can make a slave owner feel that perhaps that the people they've enslaved are savages and that living as slaves made them live better than they had, that they were rescued from a life of savagery in Africa. This was the argument a lot of slave owners made. Obviously, it's ridiculous, but it was convenient to believe it. And also, they believed they were providing slaves with Christianity. So, as being a slave, we'll see that argument would be thrown right back at slave owners by the abolitionists. We'll look later on. So, the idea that black people were biologically inferior helped support the idea of slavery. And consequently, even when slavery was ended after the Civil War, the racism would continue to linger. So the idea of slaves as being them and slave owners being us is generally that speaking of the way of dividing societies and stratifying it between those who provide labor by force and those who benefit from it. There are some examples of black Africans owning slaves, but it was very rare. Generally speaking, there were no white slaves, obviously, and but the ownership of slavery as property had a very strong racial characteristic. So once you have this, you want to stop and take a look at question number 13, which looks at non-economic arguments for slavery. We've also looked at the relationship between slave and status. When you're done with that, come back to this presentation on part 2. Okay, we're looking now at part 3 of your notes. Slavery was often called the peculiar institution. It had become peculiar to the South and sometimes an awkward subject. I mean, it was all around, but oftentimes people certainly didn't want to challenge that. And we'll talk a little bit more about how the discussion about slavery and its justification could be a very dangerous conversation in the South. It was just accepted as something you couldn't question. So we're going to take a look at question 14, which looks at the change in technology. And how did the change in technology make cotton king in the South? Circa 1800, some of the founding fathers like Jefferson and Washington, who were slave owners, felt like the institution would eventually die out in America, that it would just simply devolve. And Washington himself would free many of his slaves at his death. Jefferson seemed very addicted to his slaves. You have to remember, there might be a moral question about slavery, but there was also that economic issue. If they were property and slavery made a person rich, giving up that property would be a very difficult economic decision for the slave owner. By 1808, as it was put in the Constitution, the importation of slavery had ended, but a supply of slaves simply through the breeding of slaves continued, and slaves were bought and sold between plantations throughout the South. Slavery did generally die out in the North, but it became increasingly important in the South because of some important economic developments. We need to look at the man Eli Whitney, who you may have looked at last year. Eli Whitney had made two very important developments. He was an inventor from, I believe, Connecticut, and one of them was the idea of interchangeable parts. And interchangeable parts allowed the factory system in the North to continue to thrive. And the cotton gin, another one of his inventions, would make southern cotton, which was really notoriously difficult to clean with seeds, and made it much more economically feasible to process cotton. So when you put this all together, the need for slaves who would pick cotton, whereas the cleaning of cotton became automated, the demand for cotton with northern textile factories and the cotton gin able to provide clean cotton for those factories, there was need for cotton pickers, which of course was not automated at all, required the labor of large numbers of people at very difficult work. So as the cotton economy began to grow in the South, so did slavery. And I'll show you this in the next slide. So this is on question 15. You want to take a look at a piece of data. One of the things that you see too, I mentioned about the term of manumissions, people like Washington decided death to free their slaves. But when slaves become more valuable to the Southern cotton economy, it became less likely that a slave would be freed at his death, at the death of his owner. He would be passed on to his children as property. Take a look at this chart. On the axis on the left, you see the size of cotton versus the number of slaves. We're taking a look at number of slaves in the U.S. and then the production of cotton in bales. And you see a correlation between one and the other. As cotton production grew, so did the number of slaves. And you can see by 1860, the growing cotton economy, which had grown huge in the South, Southern cotton was feeding textile mills not just in the North but in Great Britain, and the textile industry was taking off. And the demand for cotton, of course, could not be kept up without having slave labor to do that. So take a look at question 15, and how does it support the connection between the growth of cotton and the growth of the institution of slavery? So I guess the point being that slavery did not die out in the early 19th century as predicted by some of the founders. Indeed, it became more important to a growing economy. Okay, stop here, and then we'll get to question number 16. As the 19th century progressed, the early 1800s, we're going to see a divergence or separating of the economy in the North and the economy in the South. Southern cotton would support a growing textile industry in the North, but that textile industry depended on wage labor, where cotton production in the South depended on slave labor. As this did happen, many Northerners found the contradiction between slavery and America's idea of all men created equal was increasingly unbearable. And there's a growth of a movement that's called abolitionism. Abolitionists are one of the number of different movements we'll see in American history who challenge the challenge statuses as they set, and they worry about the rights of individual groups of Americans. To them, abolitionists who saw the process of slavery as really an inhumanity and as something that was against Christianity and against American civil ideas of equality. Now, we're going to look at, if you get a chance to look at, I want you to look at this video, and it's a dramatization of William Lloyd Garrison, who we'll look at later on, an abolitionist from New England, who is speaking to Frederick Douglass, who was a runaway slave and a very articulate, powerful force about the power of slavery. When you look at Frederick Douglass, it's difficult to see how this man lived and still believe in the idea that somehow along the line biologically that Black Americans were inferior. And Frederick Douglass worked with people like William Lloyd Garrison to create and energize a growing movement in the North that would try to see the end of slavery. So at the end of this slide, go watch that video. People like the abolitionists saw slavery as immoral and a violation of human rights. Indeed, they saw it such an affront that they were willing to break the law in order to rescue slaves. Abolitionists were often viewed as dangerous radicals among a lot of people because they were willing to destroy a social order that they thought was evil. British activists were early in the abolition movement. They blocked the international slave trade, and it, of course, became something where the slave trade still existed within the United States. And that is what the abolitionists in America were attempting to stop. So the ongoing question, obviously, is here at this point where America is a growing country. The frontier was moving westward. As states were admitted to the Union, and of course, changing the political balance in the Senate and the House of Representatives, would states be free or would they be slave? Because as we know that in the North, slavery eventually became outlawed. Would a new state become a slave state? Well, the Missouri Compromise, which you may have already looked at in 1820, allowed Missouri to come in as a slave state with Maine as a free state as a balance, and also set a geographic limit on the expansion of slavery. That compromise is going to hold for a few decades, but by the time we get to the 1850s, as we'll see shortly, that compromise will break down. So take a look at this issue: is how did slavery become an emotional and bitter division in the early part of the 19th century? As you can imagine, the debate became increasingly contentious. The morality of slavery became increasingly dangerous. You'll see the word antebellum. You may have heard that word before. Ante means before, and bellum means war. So the term antebellum means the South before the Civil War. You may have heard of the band Lady Antebellum, and they changed their name in part because antebellum is oftentimes seen as a way to glorify the South before the Civil War, the South of slavery. So it's sometimes considered to be kind of insensitive to the issue of how slavery supported the antebellum South. So that just a little bit of a side note. Slave rebellions were deadly, and there were slave rebellions throughout. In many cases, and of course, a slave rebellion that would spread could create widespread damage, not just the loss of the property of slaves to the Southern economy, but slave rebellions could be deadly and kill people. So in many ways, slavery was only existed by terror, and when you use terror to maintain an order, terror will also be used to destroy it. So we're going to see that the debate against slavery would challenge the conscience of many people in the South, and it could only, and we know that vocal Southern congressmen would whip up emotional support for the defense of slavery, and they were called fire eaters. We'll look at this a little bit later in a primary source. So stop the slide and look at your question number 17. So to kind of wrap this up and put this together, we look at the last question. It says history serves as the final judge in disputes. When we look at the issue of slavery, I think that obviously most of us would, or all of us would find that to be a morally reprehensible condition. So the people who propose to support slavery seem to be on the wrong side of history. Just like, for example, in the 20th century, Adolf Hitler, who was once seen to be bold and progressive, was seen in history obviously to be on the wrong side of history. But we can look at the South, the race-based stratification that divided the society among black and white, legally supported slavery in southern states while it died out in the North. Slavery became more important in the South, but it also grew strongly opposed in the North as morally and politically wrong. The nation had attempted to work through the political conflict regarding slavery through compromise. We saw the Missouri Compromise, but we're going to see coming up that compromise became more difficult as the South became more dependent and more violent in its defense of slavery, and voices in the North became more willing to fight and support the end of slavery. Now, that's not the end of the story. In history, it never really seems to end, and race-based stratification that we see as in support of slavery continues to divide American society today. And if you doubt that, take a look at the fight about taking down monuments of those people who defended slavery in the Civil War. It's still a very emotional and contentious issue. So take a look at question 18. Okay, to wrap up here, I'd like you to think about your opinion. How do you think the existence of slavery in the South, which became increasingly important but also dangerous to maintain through terror, and the lack of support of slavery, or even its opposition, which was primarily in the North, how do you think that would divide the country geographically to the point where by 1861 we're going to have a civil war? And at the bottom of your note sheet, there is a list of some of the ideas that we looked at. Check them off and see if you can understand those questions and what they mean. All right, folks, good luck. Thank you.